To load it, you simply open the lever, the drop block, the drop here. You slide the cartridge home, bring up the lever, it's now cocked and ready to fire. There's no safety catch with the Martini. There's an indicator to tell you that it's ready to fire. When you fire it, the rifle goes off, the firing pin fires forward and hits the centre fire cartridge. To eject the cartridge, in the same action, you simply open the lever and the round is ejected. Simple, it was soldier proof. These will kill you at a mile.
The Martini-Henry Rifle, one of the most iconic weapons in British military history. It was the rifle used by British infantrymen during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. There are a lot of myths about it. A lot of people blame it for the British defeat at Isandlwana. But is there any truth to this? I'm joined today by a man called Neil Aspinshaw, who's the expert on the Martini-Henry, fired it tens of thousands of times, has written a book about it. He's been here speaking at the Clash of Empires exhibition that's currently taking place in London, and I pulled him aside to tell me more all about this iconic weapon. So stay tuned till the end, guys, to find out Neil's thoughts on all of the controversial issues. And also, if you've ever fired one, please comment below, let me know what it's like, and let me know what other rifles you'd love to fire.
Yeah, well, these are two contemporary rifles of the time. We've got a Martini-Henry Mark I, that's from 1874 through to about 1877, 1878. Then you've got a Martini-Henry Mark II, which was developed in 1877 and became the standard service arm for the next 10 years. They're both single-shot breech-loading rifles. They were adopted by the British Army in September of 1874. They were formally issued by October 1874. So by the Zulu War of 1879, the men had been well versed with them. They'd had them for 5 years. So they knew how to handle the weapons, they knew its vices and its forebarrels, and how to shoot them at range. The soldiers are expected to fire at least 90 live rounds a year, live rounds in practice, and also between 100 and 200 rounds of blank firing for volley firing exercise, etc. But the rifle itself, it's a single shot breech loader. It's simplicity in itself. To load it, you simply open the lever, the drop block, the drop here. You slide the cartridge home, bring up the lever, it's now cocked and ready to fire. There's no safety catch with the Martini. There's an indicator to tell you that it's ready to fire. When you fire it, the rifle goes off, the firing pin fires forward and hits the centre fire cartridge. To eject the cartridge, in the same action, you simply open the lever and the round is ejected. Simple, it was soldier proof. These will kill you at a mile. Accuracy is incredible. We're talking about a target about the size of a dinner plate at 100 yards, a dustbin lid at 500 yards. You will hit it. It'll put a bullet through a railway sleeper at 500 yards. I know because I've done it.
I was about to say, I bet you've done that too.
It's a beautifully balanced weapon. It's sighted to 1,400 yards, but trials later were actually, the sighting would actually fire it to anything to 2,000 yards. The problem with that is the velocity of the bullet is actually just falling out of the sky at that range. But for its time, it was soldier proof and it's an absolute man stopper.
And what's the background to how it came into service? Could you give us a brief potted history of the development of the rifle?
Well, the British Army, obviously we had the Enfield musket, which the patent 53 Enfield musket. And in the early 1860s, after the Franco-Prussian War, the British Army had to devise a breech-loading weapon. The Germans had brought out a breech loader, the needle fire, the Dreyer's needle fire. We saw that the breech loader was the way forward. You didn't have to stand up to fire the weapon. The British Army decided they put a trials competition to see who could convert all their Enfield muskets, and they came up with the Enfield Snyder. And the Snyder was just a stopgap weapon, fired a centre-fire cartridge, but it was really popular. It was still being used well into the 1880s, but it was only a stopgap. So by 1865, the British Army had a trials competition, put it out to the great and the good of the gun makers to who could come up with the best service rifle. There was 104 competitors. It was whittled down to 37, then 9, but eventually there was no outright winner. But what they chose was the rifling of Alexander Henry, an Edinburgh gunsmith, and the breech mechanism of Friedrich Martini, who was a Swiss gun designer or a Swiss engineer. Later he became involved in water engine designs, but together it was the perfect rifle, so we adopted it as the Martini-Henry. Such was the British doctrine of naming the firearm after their inventor, Snyder, Martini-Henry, and later, obviously, after James Parrish Lee, the Lee Enfield and the Lee Metford. It was developed quite extensively up until about 1871, and then eventually it was perfected and went out to the army for field trials. It was not adopted at that point. And we developed the rifle until eventually we came out with this, which is the Martini-Henry Mark I. It's very similar to the Mark II. There's a few design flaws inside it which they found about the trigger assembly, the sighting, but effectively this is the rifle. This particular example was made in November 1874, but it's the classic Mark I rifle of its time.
Brilliant.
The British Army actually took it on. It was promulgated as an official rifle of the Army in September 1874, and delivery started taking place by October 1874. Eventually, but the 24th 424 to San Luana would have got theirs in Malta in the early months of 1875. They had to be shipped out there to change. So they changed from the Snyder to the Martini-Henry. It's a quantum leap.
And that's the 1st Battalion, lads?
1st Battalion, yeah, absolutely. And they would have been issued with this, with the common bayonet of its time. Now, the storage came, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, when the British Army took the Martini, they hadn't got an official bayonet for it. So what they actually adopted was a conversion of the old Enfield musket bayonets, which is this one, which is the, what they call the 5374 pattern. Now you can see it's a socket bayonet, so it locks on like a light bulb socket. You can see that it curves away. There's a definite curve to the blade.
Yeah.
That's because it was for a muzzle loading rifle, and it meant you could load the rifle without stabbing your hand. But it decided as an expedient way, they bushed them, and it was perfect for the Martini.
Did it weaken it with that curve? Does that make it a weaker blade?
No, inherently the triangular socket bayonet was very strong. The disadvantage was that a lot of these bayonets were already 20 and 30 years old by the time they were bushed. So you've got basically a form of metal fatigue. In 1876, they developed a new bayonet for it, which is a variation on it, which is called the common long socket bayonet. Or it's become known as the Pattern 76 for its time. Now that is a 22-inch variant of the original 5374. It was designed to give you a 6-foot reach. The reason being, the French had developed a rifle with a bayonet which gave them a reach just under 6 feet. Our adversary was going to be the French, not the Zulus.
And this was used by the 2nd Battalion, the B Company at Rorke's Drift, is that right?
Yeah. Henry Hawke says in his memoirs in the Royal Magazine in 1905 that they were using the lunge bayonet, or the lunger bayonet, as this became known. But he did say that some of the men had the old pattern. So it does go to prove. But of course, B Company, most of the guys were shipped out from Chatham in 1878. The chances are they could have had their bayonets upgraded by that time. And true, their rifles could have been upgraded to the Mark II. Certainly the 1st Battalion never came home. They were fighting with what they got, which was the Mark I rifle and the 53 Pattern 74 bayonet.
And you've obviously shot these rifles a hell of a lot. What are some of the foibles? What are the strengths and weaknesses of both the Mark I and the Mark II?
The Mark I's main disadvantage was the trigger assembly. It had a high likelihood to go off. If you've got dirt or something in the trigger mechanism, then there's a good chance that the rifle could misfire. In fact, history's got quite an enormous twist. A certain lieutenant in the battalion was actually shot in the back by one of his own men.
This was during the Frontier War, wasn't it?
During the Frontier War. And he was invalided home. He was one of the Godwin Austins. Now, Godwin Austin was commander of B Company, because then when he was sent home because of a bullet shot through his shoulder, and the tunic is still in the regimental museum with the bullet hole in it, that he was the command of the company went to the 2nd lieutenant. It was a certain Gonville Bromhead.
Never heard of him.
Yeah. So that was one of the foibles. The Mark I had particularly poor sighting on it. So they developed the sighting with the Mark II. They had a tendency to get quite hot on firing, not unmanageable, but given this fact that you could fire anything like 20 aimed rounds in about 90 seconds, with any rifle or a shotgun, it gets unmanageably hot. But the men would get around that by making their own kind of cowhide wraps, or even using the ammunition packets, the paper packets, as a wrap to prevent them burning the fingers. The other disadvantage when it gets particularly hot is the heat haze that comes off the barrel, which actually makes accurate sighting quite difficult. So if you're shooting, say, at Bisley in a competition, you wait between rounds so that the barrel actually cool down a little bit. What the men did do, though, to clear fouling, they'd blow down the barrel, so the moisture from your breath would actually lubricate the powder fouling in and keep it moist. But they developed the ammunition for it, the cartridge for it, and the cartridge that they used had got a wax plug behind the bullet, a beeswax plug, and the idea was that atomized on firing and lined the ball with melted beeswax, ready to lubricate for the next round. So there was kind of completely developing the rifle over the next 5 or 6 years, but it was decided by the early 1880s, with European movements, that we had to go to something faster and more efficient, and hence the Martini fell out of use by about 1889 when it was replaced by the Lee Metford. So it was a very short service rifle for the British Army. It's probably the most famous one, or one of the most famous ones. Battle ranges to Victorian times is much misunderstood. There's kind of a legacy that they open fire to 100 yards. At later battles, a standard procedure was to open fire between 500 and 800 yards. And the officer would call the range, the men would set the sighting on his sight ladder, and it's graduated. So you've got a sight ladder which is 1 to 400 yards. So you basically slide the slider to set the sight. There it is set at 400. Then you'd lift the ladder up, and then it's sighted between 500 and 1400 yards. And you basically elevate the rifle to suit. You've got to think at 500 yards, a man lying down, firing a target on the ground, the bullet will go at 8 feet in the air to come back down. So it's flying through what's an arc, so its apogee would be 8 feet. At 1,000 yards, the apogee is more likely to be about 25 feet, but it's still accurate. It's a Whitworth sight, and the sighting is particularly accurate.
And then your talk today here at the Clash of Empires exhibition was about the scapegoat of history, that the Martini-Henry has perhaps been unfairly blamed for the British defeat at Isandlwana. Could you talk us through a little bit about some of the accusations made against the weapon and what your assessment is?
A lot of it revolves around the actual ammunition itself, and it's become, I think, after Donald Morris wrote The Washing of the Spears, and history has become a little bit mixed. So they take primary evidence from before the Zulu Wars and after. So you've got the development of the Martini, and there was problems. There was problems with the cartridges delaminating and falling apart and becoming misshapen. But the Army developed that into the Mark III cartridge. And the Mark III cartridge this is a kind of classic Mark III cartridge. Unlike the earlier examples, the base plate is thicker, the brass is thicker, there's 2 base plates, and there's a steel interliner in place. You can actually see on this, there's a little hole here, a view hole, so the inspector could see that the strengthening piece was actually in place. It's loose fitting, it fire forms. When it fires, it expands and fills the breech and forms a gas type breech. The issue, the history has it, that the base plate could tear off. The actual primer forms like a rivet which holds it into place. Now, in early examples, that certainly happened. But by 1873, with the development of the Mark III ammunition, they basically eliminated that as a problem. And all earlier Marks of ammunition was actually withdrawn from service. So did base plates extract? Yes, they did. And there's primary source reports of that happening. But when I was researching the book, I found a report from Captain Eyre Crabby of the 4th Grenadier Guards. Now, he was interviewed in 1885 at Horse Guards in the committee, in front of the whole committee, and the Duke of Cambridge was there, the Small Arms Factory was there, Buller was there, and they were being asked questions about the Martini's performance in the Sudan. And a revealing question came up from that, and they asked Crabby, on service, did you ever see the base plate of the cartridge detach, rendering the rifle useless? What Crabby replied when I read it was staggering. He said, on service I never saw that. Before the Sudan campaign, Crabby had been the battalion's musketry inspector for 7 years.
So he should know.
He must have seen hundreds of thousands of rounds fired. He'd never seen the base plate detach. The only person who reported it happening was actually a Royal Marine. And one of the problems they found on sea service is the Martini cartridge had verdigris on it. The salt water affected the brass. It raised an interesting point, though, that the gunpowder eroded the brass. And what was happening, the Woolwich Arsenal was actually lining the inside of the case with shellac as a seal to prevent the gunpowder.
What's shellac?
Shellac is a varnish. What they found, though, is that in the earlier Marks of ammunition, up until 1878, the shellac was coming out and gluing the cases to the inside of the cartridge, to the inside of the chamber. And Barlow said, our government Gatling is permanently being jammed with glued cases. it raises the question, if you're fighting away and firing away, then you have to stop to fight at bayonet point. You've got the cartridge in your breech and that shellac comes out and starts clearing it, then you've got a problem. There is a solution, and that solution is to take off the ramrod of the rifle and use it to batter out the cartridge. And what I'm going to do,
hard extraction pole.
Yeah, from extraction pole. So what I do, I'm going to show you how that actually works. So when you've got a jam, and if the cartridge may be partly in place, you can't eject it. It's stuck in it. Nothing's ejecting it out. The extractor's not working. And that might be a misshaped cartridge. It may have jammed in the breech. What you do, you take the ramrod and drop it down the barrel of the gun. So you take the rammer and knock out the cartridge.
Okay.
And we know that because Hook said after the Battle of Rorke's Drift, my rifle jammed several times and I had to use the ramrod freely to remove it.
And then you just tip the rifle, it comes back out.
You tip the rifle, the ramrod comes back out, the cartridge has been ejected and you're ready to fire the next round, which is not particularly good if somebody's running towards you, an NASA guy, but it proves the point. The problem is the early pattern ramrod that came with the Martini didn't fit down the barrel. So what I had to do then is apply the jag, and that's the jag for the rifle.
What exactly is a jag?
Right, that screws on the end of the ramrod, so it's part of the cleaning equipment for the rifle. What you have is a muzzle protector. Now, the soldier at the mark should have his muzzle protector fitted. That protects the rifle and the bore, but it's got a hole in it. That's actually a ferrule to help you clean the rifle. So what you did when you're cleaning the rifle, you remove the ramrod, you pushed it through the muzzle protector, and you screwed on the jag. Now the jag is a rotary capstan. You put your piece of oiled rag around that, which then rotates with the twist of the rifling of the barrel. You simply put the muzzle protector on, so that protects the bore from the rod, so it's acting as a ferrule, and you would wipe the rifle up or down. The jag is now rotating with the twist of the rifling, it's pulling through the dirt and filing from the rifling. And we know with the earlier pattern ramrod that didn't fit down the barrel, the standard shout from the ranks was, "Who's got a jag?" So the men knew they had to screw the jag on to give it enough reach to knock out the cartridge. Every man had a jag. It's the case if he took it out on the battlefield with him.
Do you know what I find interesting? Maybe I'm going off on a tangent here. Is I've spent a lot of time in my day job embedded with the military, including places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And I remember the first time I got caught in a gunfight alongside the Royal Marines, guy next to me, 2 minutes into it, says, "Has anyone got a hard extraction pole?" And in the end, I had to give him my Leatherman to clear a stoppage in his SA-80, and that's how many 140 years after?
And the standard piece of equipment that came with the Martini-Henry, which is another myth debunker. If you use an SA-80, a modern, or even one of the old L1A ones, you get a combination tool. Every soldier gets it with his kit. And with the Martini-Henry, for every 5 rifles sent out to the field, you've got one of these, which is a combination tool. Now this does everything on the rifle. You can literally take it to bits. So every corporal, armourer sergeant worth his salt would have one of these in his knapsack, because you can use it to do a variety of things on the rifle. There's a pin on it to knock out the extractor. There's a pricker on it, which you can use almost like a toothpick to clear out any dirt or debris. There's a anvil here, which is like a vise, so the pin which holds the firing pin on, you can squeeze it, the breech block pin, squeeze it to fit it in. Well, what's most important, it was massively overlooked, there's 3 screwdrivers. The legacy about not being able to do ammunition boxes, because there's no screwdrivers, tends to go a little bit up in smoke.
Yeah, this is the story that they didn't have enough ammunition at the firing line at Isandlwana due to the inability to open the ammo boxes.
Yeah. There's a chance, obviously, the armourer, the kind of regimental quartermasters would be undoing the boxes, but when the firing got so intense, he probably couldn't get them open fast enough and sending the ammunition boxes out to the line. But of course, standard field regulations from 1877, it's categoric that there's a standing order that the distribution of ammunition boxes must be carefully practiced. Carefully practiced. Now, if you're a lieutenant and adjutant worth your salt, you carefully practice. When your men go out to the line, you send ammunition boxes. Even though you've got 70 rounds on you, there's a chance that a rifle that can fire 10 aimed rounds a minute will give you 7 minutes worth of firing. that was never, rarely did you ever get to that rate of firing. In fact, at Kambula, they only fired 31 rounds during the battle. But if there's a chance you'd be engaged, you would ensure the reserve supplies were sent out. After a period of time, you start to run out, and this is where you get the reports about them sending ammunition out in mule carts. There would have become a time that they're getting low on ammunition. When they got the firing to the line, to the actual boxes to the line, there was ways of getting in it. Yes, you could smash it open. And if you ever read Richard Satchpole Riding's book about the Battle of Maiwand, there is evidence that they were struggling to get the boxes open because they were actually officers. The chances are they hadn't got a tool with them. And that was Mellison Bray, Lieutenant Reddy, saw them getting ammunition boxes to the line and trying to break it open with rifle butts. So there's some conjecture in that. But of course, Maiwand, the expenditure at Maiwand was phenomenal. The official firing of the 516 men, including the officer of the 66th at Maiwand, was 97,075 rounds in a 3-hour engagement. Think of that. At Rorke's Drift, 100 men fired 22,000. That's 1 round every, well, 20 rounds per hour on that basis.
20 rounds per hour per man?
On that basis. At Maiwand, the expenditure in a 3-hour battle was 60 rounds per man.
Wow.
97 rounds average per man. The maths about these rifles jamming up and not being used after time tends to go a little bit up in smoke, although the result was the same at Maiwand as it was at Zulu War, of course.
So we can put to bed some of these myths finally then?
I think the myths, of course, nobody survived the battlefield at Zulu War to tell the story.
At least not from the firing line,
Not from
right?
the firing line. But the fact that if the actual myth was put to fact at Rorke's Drift, that was a very short battle indeed. We know men survived. Hook only gives us a kind of a snapshot of the problems about his rifle jamming several times. But any people who fire even a modern firearm know, as your friend found out in Afghanistan, that even a modern rifle jams periodically. It's just something that happens. Would the men know how to overcome that? Of course they would. It would have been practiced at using the ramrod and various ways of getting it out. But I think it's become, or myth has become law, but with no primary evidence. The actual evidence is the fact that it rarely happened, but it's become part of the kind of the scapegoat for a disaster.
Tell us about your book on the Martini-Henry and where can people get hold of it?
Well, the Martini-Henry for Queen and Empire, 8 years in the writing. It only started as an article for a magazine, then grew arms and legs because I got carried away by fact and debunking a lot of the myths. It covers the whole development of the arm, right the way through the trials, right the way through the jamming, the battles, the ammunition boxes, the bayonets, and it was the result of hours spent at Kew and the Royal Armouries at Leeds getting fact. It's available through my website, the Martini-Henry Society shop. You can also get it direct from me, emailing me directly. There's some for sale at the show today or this weekend. It's £45 a copy, but it's a 256,000 words and 156 double back pages. It took a lot of writing.